Hello everyone, I'm Tajinder Sidhu and we welcome you all in the official channel of Dr. Raghbendra Jha. Dr. Raghbendra Jha, welcome you in this interview session.
Thank you very much.
And today we are going to talk about one of his recent work. He has worked really hard on one of his recent books, Facets of India's Economy and Her Society, Volume 1. Recent Economic and Social History and Political Economy is its title. So here's a book, everyone, that Dr. Jha has worked on. It's a 2 volume, so it's a first volume, and we got another book, Facets of India's Economy and Her Society, Volume 2. So it's a Volume 2. So we are going to talk about Volume 1 today with Dr. Raghbendra Jha. So Dr. Jha, so I would like to ask that there is no dearth of books, scholarly and popular, on India, and then why did you write these volumes and what are these volumes about?
Thank you very much and welcome everybody to this session. So these 2 volumes are about some aspects of India's economy and society. What distinguishes them is that they take a long view of both and try to position them on a broad cultural and historical perspective. So these are the most important characteristics of these 2 volumes. Now, one of the most remarkable things about India is that it is a continuing cultural civilization for more than 7,000 years. So if you go to any part of the country, you will have similar cultural and social practices, even though the language may be different, even though the nuances of these practices may be different. So this is a remarkable thing which is rarely seen in the whole world. And so it is important to understand India's economy and society within the broader context of this cultural continuity. And we must remember that this cultural continuity has existed, has survived hundreds of years of foreign occupation, first from the Islamic countries and then from Britain. And yet it is going strong, it is flourishing in fact now, and it is doing reasonably well given its ancient history and given the various external forces that impinged on the country. Furthermore, we should remember that when India became independent on 15th August 1947 and became a republic on 26th January 1950, India did something absolutely unimaginable. It it declared itself a sovereign republic on liberal principles. It gave everybody the right to vote, right in the beginning. You should recall that women got the vote in the United States in 1920, and the Civil Rights Act in the United States was passed in 1968. And the United States was in a much better economic shape than India was in 1947. So despite all that, India had the courage to declare itself a liberal democratic republic with equality of all citizens before the law. And it progressed accordingly. Many people in the West thought that India's experiment was not going to be successful, but exactly the opposite has happened. India has now is recognized as one of the most successful democracies in the world. It is the largest democracy in the world. In purchasing power parity terms, it's the 3rd largest economy in the world. In dollar exchange rate terms, it is the 6th largest economy in the world. So if you combine all these things along with its cultural and historical continuity, you have a remarkable nation. And my reading of the literature on India is that most people have not, in fact there is, if I may say so, there is not a single book which combines all these factors into a cogent explanation of how the Indian economy and society has progressed. It has had lots of problems. So for example, when India became independent, there were centrifugal tendencies. There were more than 500 small kingdoms which had to be incorporated in India. India has faced external aggression after independence, and yet it has done well, and it is now serving as an example for many other countries in the world. So I thought that a holistic view of all these things, of all these facets of India's economy and society is essential, and this is what these volumes are trying to do. So I recognize that doing full justice to all these factors is near impossible within the context of one book or even in 2 volumes. So what I have chosen to do is to concentrate on facets, on aspects of India's economy and society, which I think are crucial, which are critical, and have gone into depth into these issues, and have tried to give my narrative about India's economy and society.
Very good. All right. So next thing I would like to ask about your recent book, Professor Jha, is can you please provide a brief overview of the contents of the volumes?
Okay, yeah, sure. Yeah, so the first volume consists of 8 chapters, and the chapters are basically, first it tries to give you a overview of the Indian economy, of the performance of the Indian economy since the year 0 AD, right from, so the very long view on the Indian economy, and it then gives you a view of the structural transformation of the Indian economy, how it has changed from being an agriculture-centered economy to a little bit of manufacturing and then some services as well. Then we go to a chapter on land, labor and population in India. So in this chapter, what I have tried to do is to give you an account of India's land composition, what does India's land, what properties does India's land resources have. I give you a sense of perspective on India's labor composition, what kind of labor force we have, its skill composition, its gender composition, and how it has evolved over time, and population. And the population is extremely important. So how India's population has evolved over the years, and that's chapter 2 in the first volume. In the third chapter of the first volume, I talk about human development indicators in India. So basically, national income and an indicator of education and an indicator of health, which are combined into the United Nations Human Development Index. I've tried to see how India has progressed in the ranking of countries on the Human Development Indicator, and look and examine the welfare programs that support these human development indicators. The fourth chapter in the first volume is an account of Muslim aggression on India, and how India, why did they come to India, and what happened to India as a consequence of that. It goes back all the way to the invasion of India by Alexander, and then the Muslims, and then the Mughals finally, until the death of the last significant Mughal emperor, that was Aurangzeb in 1707, and then the decay of central authority in India, and how the British used that opportunity to establish their sovereignty over India. That's chapter 4. And the chapter 5 deals with the impact of British rule on India, economic impact of British rule in India. So I did dwell on 3 crucial things. The first thing I do is to examine the impact of British rule on agriculture in India, because agriculture was the mainstay of the economy. And then I look at the economic drain from India. How much economic surplus was taken by the British from India to Britain and for their other activities. And finally, I look at the impact of Britain on India's manufacturing sector, because India used to be a major manufacturing sector hub before British rule. In fact, it is said that before the British came to India, when India sent its textiles to Europe, Europe had nothing to sell to India. They didn't produce anything worthwhile for India. So they used to give India only gold, because they didn't have anything to sell to India. But over time, India became a very manufacturing sector a failed case, because the British imposed their textiles on India, and India was reduced to becoming an exporter of cotton textiles. So that's chapter 5. Then in chapter 6, I talk about India's freedom struggle, how India actually attained freedom. And it starts off with movements prior to the 1857 uprising. The 1857 uprising, many people say, is the first effort at resisting British rule in India, but that's not true. It started in the 18th century, and I give an account of that struggle. And then I look at the 1857 revolution, 1857 uprising in India, and why it was defeated. And then I go to a theme which is recurring in this book, which is that in 1857, when the uprising was defeated, there was a feeling of utter helplessness in the country. The country had risen to try to overcome foreign rule, and that foreign rule, but the foreign rulers had crushed that movement very emphatically, and they were impacting on India's culture, India's cultural values. They were impacting on India's sense of self-worth, because they had reduced India to a very poor country, and they were basically India was basically being told that it was not so it would certainly not be able to compete with Britain. It was a secondary nation. It was a subservient nation to Britain. So then a very important factor occurred, and which is that Indians realized that fighting for freedom could not occur through violent means in India. They had tried in the 1857 uprising, and it failed, very bitterly failed. And so they realized that the first thing to do was to re-establish India's cultural moorings. And there I think that one of the most significant events that occurred during that period was the birth and the activities of the great saint Ramakrishna Paramhans and his disciple Swami Vivekananda, who in his wonderful speech to the World Conference on Religions in Chicago re-established Hinduism as a world religion and Hindu civilization as a world civilization, and restored to India some of its cultural pride, which had been lost completely. So from that offshoot, from that came the offshoot of Mahatma Gandhi's non-violent movement, because I think Mahatma Gandhi's non-violent movement towards India's freedom owes its existence and its intellectual moorings to the work of Swami Vivekananda and Ramakrishna Paramhans. So then I talk a lot about the various efforts by the Congress Party to gain India's independence, why it was um, satisfied with getting some kind of home rule rather than freedom in the beginning, and then the people who rebelled against. I talk about the people who rebelled against the effort of the Congress Party just to get home rule, and who wanted complete freedom. I talk about the Khilafat movement. I talk about India's immense contribution to the First World War, and then and the ramifications of that, because India for the first time in the First World War, Indians fought together and they defeated Europeans, which is something unthinkable for India in those days. So they won many battles in the battlefields of Europe, and they were able to do that, and they realized that they were not second-class citizens, that they could bring their own country to some semblance of self-respect, but the disaster that occurred after the First World War is also discussed, when instead of giving some freedom to India, all that the British did was to give us the massacre of Jallianwala Bagh and the India Gate. That's all India got from the India Gate monument in Delhi. That's all India got from the First World War from the British. So then the uprising of various revolutionaries and their crushing, and the partition of Bengal, and the sowing of seeds of Hindu-Muslim disunity, all these factors, and the role of the Indian National Army and Subhash Chandra Bose in finally delivering independence to India. These are all considered in Chapter 6. Chapter 7 is an account of India's basic constitutional structure, the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary, the composition of Indian states, what lies within the purview of a state government and the central government, and various languages of India, how disputes are settled in India. So it gives an account of that. And Chapter 8 finally is an account of India's political and economic history since the days of Jawaharlal Nehru. So it goes through the time of each of India's prime ministers, and discusses their policies, their successes, their failures, and how the economy has progressed under their leadership. That's volume 1. And volume 2 is basic. There are 3 chapters initially. The first chapter talks about the state of Indian agriculture. The second chapter talks about the state of Indian manufacturing. The third chapter talks about the state of India's services sector. Then there are other chapters. One chapter is on the structure of regional inequality in India between states, and how the goods and services tax is trying to address those inequalities. There is a chapter on India's environmental problems. What are the environmental problems that India has, and how India is trying to address them. It has another chapter on 2 key areas of the Indian economy: health and education. How India is addressing its health and education challenges. Then it looks at India's engagement with the rest of the world. So it examines how India links with the rest of the world in trade, in investment, in remittances, and various other things. So India's engagement with the world economy is really huge, as you know. There are more than 25 million people of Indian origin living outside India, and their role in India itself is becoming very significant. So it discusses that. Then it discusses various other issues of employment and employment growth and human welfare. And finally, there's a chapter on India's prospects. India was a leading country in the world before the Mughals came. In fact, it was the largest single economy in the world before the Mughals came. And then it became an abjectly poor country under British rule. And now, after 70 years of independence, it is a low middle income country. It is not an upper middle income country. So it has made progress. So what are the prospects for India? This is discussed in the final chapter of the book. This is the book.
Very nice. So seem like, Doctor, you have, I think, given an almost a really wider overview of Indian social, economic and political system in just a few pages. I think I can understand, like, you must have worked really hard to compile all those really, really wider concepts in just 1 or 2 volumes. I think it's been, has it been a challenge for you, or like, what do you think about it?
Yeah, it has been a big challenge. It was a big challenge for me, but this is a book which I had to write. Because I have observed India from within India and from without India, from outside India, and I think that I have a sense of perspective on India, which is simultaneously that of an Indian living in India and that of an Indian observing India from outside. So I thought that maybe it was useful to do, and this is something I had to write. So I've really enjoyed writing it. Yes, it was very hard work. I worked on it for more than 5 years.
Wow.
So this is the final product now.
All right, that's very good. All right. So next one, I would like to ask you. So before we go through the next few aspects that we will be talking, we'll just take a little break, and after the break, so we'll come back and we'll talk about a little bit more about Professor Jha's work.